After that night things changed, but no one said anything. Eric and I avoided being alone together for a few days. We were polite, distant, almost robotic. My husband didn't notice a thing. He was buried in meetings, deadlines, phone calls. I watched him come home, loosen his tie, eat dinner without tasting it, and fall asleep on the couch without once asking how I was. I kept thinking about that kiss, how it made me feel seen, how wrong it was, and how much I wanted it again. Eric started coming home later, giving me space, I guess. But when we were in the same room, the air felt thick. One night, he came into the kitchen while I was finishing dishes. I expected silence, but he said, "You okay?" I didn't answer. I just nodded. He stayed quiet for a moment before whispering, "I think about it too." That broke me. After that, everything was a slow slide. We talked more again, cautiously at first. He'd stay just long enough to chat, then leave. I tried to act normal. My husband didn't notice the small shifts. How I stopped reaching for his hand, how I smiled less around him, how I started going to bed later just to sit in silence with my thoughts. Eric and I stopped pretending we didn't want more. It was all in the looks, the way he'd pause when I walked by, the way I'd linger in doorways. Every conversation felt like it was hiding another meaning. He asked me once, "Are you happy?" I didn't know what to say. I'd been telling myself I was for years, that I had everything I was supposed to want. But that question echoed in my mind at night. I started comparing them. My husband never looked up when I walked into the room. Eric noticed everything. My husband only touched me in routine ways. Quick goodbye kisses, a hand on my shoulder. Eric hadn't touched me since the kiss, but the memory of his hand on mine burned hotter than anything I'd felt in a long time. It wasn't just about attraction. It was the emotional pull. The fact that I could say something and Eric would stop and listen like it mattered. I told him things I hadn't told anyone. About how small I'd started to feel in my own life, how invisible I felt in my marriage. He never tried to fix it. He just let me talk. I didn't mean to let it go further. I thought if I ignored it long enough it would pass. But everything kept leading back to him. The way he looked at me like I was still someone worth wanting. The way I started believing it. The night before it happened, I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. Not in a vain way. Just wondering if I still recognized the woman looking back. I didn't. She looked tired, guilty, but alive. And I realized I hadn't felt alive in a very long time. The night it happened didn't feel like some grand event. It began like any other. My husband was out late for a company dinner. Said he wouldn't be back until after midnight. I stayed in, made pasta, opened a bottle of wine, and tried to distract myself with a movie. I didn't expect Eric to come home early. When he walked in, our eyes met, and neither of us looked away. He asked if I was okay. I nodded, but it was a lie. I wasn't okay. I was spinning in my own head, overwhelmed by everything I'd been trying not to feel. He poured himself a glass and stood across from me, silent. The energy was different. Neither of us pretended. No casual small talk. No tiptoeing. Just heat, tension, truth hanging in the air. He asked, "Do you want this, or am I imagining everything?" I didn't answer right away. I was tired of pretending I didn't know what I wanted. Said yes. That one word unraveled everything. He moved toward me like he was afraid I'd change my mind. I didn't. Couldn't. I had been touched 1,000 times in my life, but nothing had ever felt like that first moment. His hands were firm, certain, but his eyes searched mine the whole time, asking for permission. Gave it. I wasn't thinking about consequences. I wasn't thinking about marriage vows or guilt or what it would mean in the morning. I was thinking about how warm his mouth was, how safe and dangerous he felt all at once. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't about lust. It was about being chosen, seen, pulled back to life after years of quiet numbness. He held me like I mattered, like every part of me deserved attention. And in that moment, I let myself forget the rest of the world. There was no plan. Just happened like gravity. I remember every breath, every whispered word. I remember the way he said my name like it was something precious. I had forgotten what that sounded like. When it was over, there was silence. Not awkward, not ashamed, just heavy. Real. I sat there, heart pounding, wondering who I had just become. Eric didn't say anything. He just looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face. I couldn't look back. I wasn't ready. I stayed up after he left the room. The guilt didn't come right away. What came first was sadness. Not for what I had done, but for how long I had gone without feeling anything at all. It hit me that this wasn't about Eric. Not really. It was about being so desperately empty that I let someone else fill what my husband no longer even noticed was missing. The next morning felt unreal. I moved through the house like a ghost, making coffee, folding laundry, anything to avoid sitting with the weight of what I'd done. Eric didn't come into the kitchen. I didn't go looking for him. We both knew silence was easier than facing it. When my husband walked through the door, smiling, tired, talking about how exhausting the dinner had been, I nodded along like nothing had changed. But everything had. I expected something to crack, an awkward glance, a slip in conversation, but nothing came. That's when the real guilt started to settle in. Not from fear of being caught, but from realizing how easy it was to hide. That terrified me more than anything. I looked at my husband and wondered how many times I had smiled at him with a lie sitting in my throat. It wasn't just that one night. It was all the nights before it when I'd already started pulling away. Eric kept his distance after that. He was polite, quiet, made plans to stay with a friend soon. We didn't talk about what happened. There was nothing to say that wouldn't tear it all down. I think we both knew we couldn't go backward, and we didn't have a future either. He was a moment, brief, intense, and already slipping away. I kept thinking I'd feel something definitive. Shame, regret, relief. But mostly I felt numb. The kind of numb that comes after a storm, when everything is still standing but nothing feels the same. I caught myself replaying that night in my mind more times than I wanted to admit. Not for the pleasure, but for the clarity. I wasn't confused anymore. I knew how unhappy I'd been. I just didn't know what to do with that truth now that I couldn't unsee it. One night my husband and I argued over something small, laundry I think. But underneath it was everything else. He asked me if I was still in this. I didn't answer. I think he already knew something was broken. A week later he brought up therapy. I agreed. It felt like the right thing to do, even if I wasn't sure I believed in it. I never told him what happened. Came close once. I stared at him across the kitchen table and opened my mouth, but the words stayed stuck. I wasn't afraid of losing him. I was afraid of what it would do to him. Or maybe I was just afraid to fully own the damage I'd done. Eric moved out quietly. No goodbye, no closure. Just gone. I didn't chase him. It would have made it harder. It was better this way. Unfinished, unspoken. My marriage didn't magically fix itself. But we're trying or pretending to. Some days it feels like progress. Other days, I feel like I'm walking through the motions of someone else's life. I don't know what the ending is. I don't know if I'll stay, if things will get better, or if I'll always carry this secret. But I do know that for one night I felt real again. And that feeling doesn't disappear, no matter how hard I try to forget it. Weeks passed. Life kept moving even though I felt stuck in place. I woke up next to my husband, made breakfast, went to work, smiled at neighbors, laughed at the right moments. No one could tell. I was functioning maybe even better than before. But inside something had fractured. Not from what I did but from what I realized. I had been disappearing for years, and no one noticed until I stepped out of line. Therapy became routine. We showed up, answered questions, talked about communication, unmet needs, emotional distance. I said all the right things. So did he. We cried once. We blamed stress. We promised to try harder. Some days felt hopeful. Other days, I stared at the wall and wondered if we were just performing a recovery we didn't actually believe in. Eric never reached out. I didn't either. His absence was loud at first, then quieter. Like a ringing in my ears that faded over time but never fully disappeared. I thought about him sometimes. Wondered where he was, if he thought about that night, if he hated me for it or understood why it happened. But mostly, I thought about how quickly something so intense became a secret no one would ever speak of. There was a part of me that wanted to confess. Not for absolution, but just to be honest. But I couldn't. Not without burning down everything. Not without dragging someone else through the fire with me. So I lived with it. Carry it. Quietly. What surprised me most wasn't the guilt. It was how deeply I missed the feeling of being chosen. I kept chasing that feeling, in the way I dressed, the way I talked in therapy, the way I tried to rebuild what I once had. But it wasn't the same. Something authentic had cracked open that night, and everything after felt like an echo. I don't think I'm a bad person. I think I was a lonely person who made a selfish decision. I think I let myself get so small inside my marriage that I clung to the first thing that made me feel visible again. It wasn't love. It wasn't even about Eric. It was about wanting to feel alive in my own skin. People talk about infidelity like it's just betrayal, just sex, just deception. But they never talk about the silence before it, the slow erosion of connection, the way you can be sitting next to someone you love and still feel completely alone. That's where it starts. Long before the mistake. In the quiet. I don't know if my marriage will survive. I don't know if I even want it to. Some days I feel hopeful. Others I feel trapped by the life I built on autopilot. What I do know is that I will never forget how it felt to be seen again. And I'm still figuring out whether that moment was my breaking point, or my beginning. Maybe both.